kama i kia koutou. Maybe more light out there and less up here. That would suit me fine. Kama i kia koutou katoa. Ko Grennell toku ingoa. Ko Ngāti Mutunga o Warekauri, ko Ngaitahu o Kuiwi. Engari, no te nota, taku hoa rangatira. Ko Witi Ashby, tano ingoa. Taku tūranga mai, mana hautu tuarua honunga aroe, kei te puni kōkiri. So that's a big mouthful, but it just means kind of Deputy Chief Executive at Te Puni Kōkiri with oversight for our regional partnerships mai. And I'm really pleased to be here. I'm thrilled by your stamina. There's two kind of graveyard shifts, I think, at a conference. One can be after lunch. The other's probably 9 o'clock on the morning of the third day. So I did think I was probably just going to be giving a kōrero to myself and a table full of loyal staff. So I'm really, really pleased to see you all here, because they got no choice here. So like many of you, I've come to this hui with a frame, I think, of titero, hakarongo, kōrero. You know, we want to observe, we want to listen, we want to reflect, and maybe we've got some things to say as well. Now, as a good public servant / bureaucrat, of course, you come to these things with a set of key messages that have been carefully prepared for you by loyal staff and others, and that's awesome. But I did reflect quite a lot last night on the difference between what I thought I wanted to say and what you might want to hear, because those might not be the same thing. So I did a little bit of reflecting, and as a result, we've got a couple of pages of short notes rather than the well poured over material that I had, but it does draw on it. And I think that you'll have come with a number of questions to this hui, and some of those are questions that we as government share with you. How do we do it? How do we do it? How do we support our whānau into better housing? How do we support our whānau to help themselves on that journey? And we've heard some of the stories in relation to tenancy management and the sorts of things that need to be thought about there. So we've got those kind of questions that are shared questions. We've got some questions that are probably what I'd call more of a technical or an example nature. So how does someone else do it? And we had those awesome examples yesterday from different roe of the work that people are doing and the things that they've achieved. And I got the chance to speak to a few people yesterday who were earlier in their journey, who came away really excited. Go, wow, they did this, they did that. I'm going to go and talk to them, and I'm going to follow up with them, because that's such an exciting journey. So there's those kinds of questions. But I suspect when you're engaging perhaps with me, as well as those questions that we share and those questions that pertain to the mahi that you're doing with your own whānau, you've probably got some kind of grunty questions for government too. And I thought I might talk about some of those in respect of the Māori Housing Network and the mahi that Te Puni Kōkiri does, to give just a little bit more context to that and to help you think about the way that we're seeing things at the moment. Kei te pai? All right, we're all in the same room, same kaupapa, that's awesome. So no one's left yet, and I think we agree we're in the same hui. So for us, as the Minister reflected yesterday, we have priorities that sit and centre around whānau. That's the core and that's the starting place. And I think everyone knows it's not just about the house. So we've talked a lot about how we put whānau at the middle, and you will know that whānau water is a key, not just policy approach, but way of living, way of being, and way of thinking. And that's very much core to what we apply to our mahi. So our housing kaupapa sits for us in the context of other investment that we look at as well. And that other investment is around whānau water, it is around the whenua, our wakapapa, and whanaketanga development. And I can't help but smile and want to meet to Whaia Poppy and the whānau, who I know will have talked to many of you, whose journey started with the Wāna Water Plan. And it's a story I hold dear to my heart because, I used to have a lot of battles with the auditors about what a whānau plan looks like. And it had to be, 3 pages or distinctive and typed and te. So when I went to their launch and I saw what they'd drawn on their piece of wallpaper, I went, ka pai, because we weren't just buying an artefact, we were buying a process of engagement. And we were buying a dialogue and we were buying a journey. So if you're interested in how that context sits and fits together for us in terms of Wāna Water, I'd really encourage you, have a look on our website. If you're not familiar with the Wāna Water Outcomes Framework, have a look at that, because we bring that thinking very much to the way we approach our mahi in relation to housing and in relation to whare. And we would expect and hope that we achieve not just a housing outcome, but other outcomes for people as well when we embark on this journey. So if we start to think about what it is that the government's going to do, then the sort of things that I tend to get hit up on in places like this, so I don't often get much time in the room of the conference, is what's the government going to do? How do we access funding and the pūtea? Who makes the decisions about the pūtea? What do they know anyway about us and about our reality? And how do we get in there? So I'm assuming that some of you have got those questions as well. Our Māori Housing Network story is a relatively short one, although our Wāna Water journey as Te Puni Kōkiri is much longer. So we took responsibility to make the Māori Housing Network operational in October last year. So we're almost a year old, which is pretty cool. And as you looked and watched a number of those presentations yesterday and some of the stories today, then in many of them there is a Māori Housing Network footprint or fingerprint or contribution that has been made. And so in this year, part of what I do, I sign the bills when they come through. And I sit at the table where the decisions are made. Now, the important thing to know about that is we don't have a back door. We have front doors, and those front doors are our regional officers and our regional staff who are part of that network. And I love talking to people, and I love talking to them about their aspirations, but we have a door that's got the same level of openness to everybody, and that's where it starts, in that kōrero, in a regional setting, because that's where the network is placed, and we have different roles as we move through our tari. They work alongside people to develop proposals, to understand what's there, to help broker relationships, all of those sorts of things. And then our 6 regional managers, alongside some other people with expertise, sit and moderate and look across the proposals. And we look to see what we can learn. We look to understand, is there another way that this could be done more cost effectively? So we've got to ask that question. Who's going to benefit, all of those sorts of things. So they sit and they have a look at that, bring it together, and then they recommend to a decision-making table. And I thought it might interest you to hear a little bit about what we consider at that table, because I think that's pretty important. So our first assumption that we make, and that with the good officers of our staff, any proposal will have, is that obviously all of the money stuff and the project management stuff and the entity credibility stuff will be sorted when it comes to the table. You'll be aware, and we had a little couple of references to the Hobson Mayor and Mr. Brash yesterday, you'll be aware that there are some people who would consider that what we do in the Māori Housing Network is part of some sort of special privilege. You'll also be aware that we won't bore you with it because it's not your job. We've got all sorts of things like the Public Finance Act and Audit New Zealand that we have to satisfy. So we ensure and we count on our staff, and they do an awesome job to work with you to make sure that those things are satisfied, that they're sorted and that they're clear. Every now and then we have to do a bit more work about that, but that's with the aim of making sure that we're all safe and that we've got a good story to tell at the end of it. Then our core question at that table comes back to whānau. Who are the whānau that are going to benefit from this mahi and from this proposal? Not necessarily, or in fact not at all, who is the organisation who will benefit, if there is any organisational benefit, but who are the whānau who will benefit? So even when we're thinking about capability building and any other sorts of investment, we've still got our line of sight all the way through to where are those whānau? Because we all know how much and how deep the need is, and that what we've got is not enough to cover it all. So we must understand and think about who those whānau are. We want to get a sense of, within what's being proposed, what whānau are going to be able to do for themselves as part of this project. That's critical. When we're taking a whānau water approach and we want to be able to support whānau on the journey to being self-managing, giving somebody a key to a ware that they've got no stakeholder interest, they haven't done any mahi in relation to, or they haven't done much thinking in relation to, doesn't always work so well. And so we want to understand what it is that whānau are going to do for themselves as part of that. Now, for some of our whānau who are in crisis and desperation, that might not be more than participate in a conversation about what's going to be required. We'll have other whānau who are going to be out there doing hard yards, like we saw in some of the presentations yesterday. But that's something we want a sense of. What are whānau going to be able to do for themselves as part of their journey? We're interested in who the partners are. Those of you who do the cool stuff, look at what they call the appropriations and how much money each government agency gets and all that sort of thing, will know and understand that our pūtea is a relatively small pūtea that's part of a raft of things, and Minister Bennett talked a little bit yesterday about the government approach to social housing all up. So ours is part of the story, but there are other partners in the story. Some of those are funding partners. Some of those might be partners that help facilitate or support you to get through some of the gnarly technical stuff that sits alongside housing. So we're interested in who the partners might be, because we don't own it. We are servants of the process. So we want to understand that. Then we want to understand what our part is. So as Te Puni Kōkiri, what are we going to contribute to? How will we structure that? How will we ensure that we are doing the best thing in the best way? And that's a responsibility that we take seriously. We've started to grapple too with some other quite challenging pātai that some of you have grappled with, and I got a bit of a flavour of that in some of the presentations yesterday. One of the things, particularly in relation to housing repairs, that we're really working through at the moment is, what are we enabling? So by that I mean that often the things that our staff are seeing, sometimes in conjunction with some of you, is really appalling conditions, and we know that. And sometimes we get called in when the conditions are such that ACC won't do any of the modifications and repairs, and the District Health Board isn't keen to put anything in there, because you're putting a handrail into something that's going to fall down. You're insulating a converted cowshed. You're putting something in an environment that is probably on a whole range of scales unsafe for our kaumātua or our tamariki. But often that's what those of you who are involved in a housing repair kaupapa or we get asked to look at. Some of those, particularly in our early and first days, It might cost, to totally repair and refurb one of those whare, you might be talking about $200,000 or $300,000. Is that the best use of the pūtea? We've got to think about that. Where people have made decisions to pick up a portable something, and truck it up a back road on the night and drop it on something that they don't have license to occupy. And then it gets even worse in condition over 2 or 3 years, and there's no infrastructure and no water and no wharepaku and all of those sort of things. And then they come to us and say, oh, we heard that you fellas can help us. Are we making the right call to support that, knowing that the next message that may well go out is, hey, guess what? If you do this, TPK will help you get it all sorted. And we might actually then be disrupting what could be quite fragile relationships between landowners and beneficiaries and others. So those are some of the sorts of things that we've been thinking about, and we challenge ourselves with, particularly in relation to the health of our kaumātua. When we look at some of the other dynamics and things to think about, whare in the context of whenua and whakapapa is so deep. It speaks right into our ukai pōtanga, speaks into all of those things that we hold dear. We have some challenging conversations sometimes with other agencies about why you would either repair and invest in or build papa kāinga in communities that are a very long way from any source of employment, for example. So why would we be moving a whole lot of people back to somewhere where there's no mahi? So those are some of the gnarly-ish sort of things that we consider, not as the core issues, but that we're grappling with as we go through these kind of processes and what we think about. The final thing, though, in relation to things that come onto the table is that we're really interested in what are the other related benefits and things that we can leverage off the whare. So is there an opportunity, for example, as we've seen with some of these, for the participation of young people in trades? Is there the opportunity to support some of our other Māori businesses and entities through this process? Is there a te ao Māori kind of benefit? So are there aspirations in terms of culture and connection that sit here? What's the health benefits and outcomes? So again, if you go back to that Wāna Water Outcomes Framework, that provides quite a nice overview of those sorts of things. So I hope that's helpful to understand that those are some of the things that we think about at that table, and to be clear and to understand that our processes are transparent. Our funding's public knowledge. Obviously, if there are private matters pertaining to an individual whānau where their whare has been repaired, then we're not blasting their private details out into the media, but our actual funding is transparent. I thought a lot last night about the Blue House. I thought a lot about the different houses that I've lived in, because it would be 30 plus over the years. Due to the circumstances of my life. I've lived in whare where when the wind blows you can see the grass in between the cracks in the floorboards. And in whare where when you open the window the whole thing fell out on the ground. Outside, we moved a lot when we were tamariki, and if you ever need someone who knows how to scrub a wardrobe, just come on by, because my mother always used to make us scrub every wardrobe before we moved out and then scrub every wardrobe when we moved in. And so I've thought about those things and about the realities that our whānau experience. And it took me back to thinking about te whare tapawha, actually. Because when we think about whare, there's a wairua aspect. Why else do we walk around with water and touching walls and blessing things and tramping the house? Because there's a wairua aspect. There's a hinangaro aspect in that the mental health and well-being of our people is critical, and a whare is an important part of that. We know about the tinana aspects. It's well proven what quality housing can do in respect of things like rheumatic fever and respiratory illnesses and all of those sorts of things. And we know that a whare provides that stability for a whānau. So as someone who takes the service aspect of public service pretty seriously, as someone who actually had, I look back, in their wedding vows, service te whānau hapu and iwi, who does that? I mean, I think the words tino rangatiratanga even crept into the wedding vows somewhere, but hey aha. So as someone who brings that frame into the mahi, I don't ask you to trust us because we're government. That's too tall an ask for where many of us have come from. I don't expect that. I would like to think that we can have respectful engagement. Sometimes we're going to have to agree to disagree, and sometimes I'm training my peeps to say no, because we have to. But I'd hope that in that we do that with respect and that we do that with generosity, and as much as possible we help you on a journey to achieve what it is that you want to achieve, and that we keep the balance of tika, pono and aroha as we do our mahi. So in closing, I'd like to acknowledge you all and your mahi. I'd like to acknowledge our staff who stepped up to a really primo challenge in October last year from a standing start, and have put their hearts and souls into the mahi as well. We're not always going to get it right, but we're always here to talk to you. We like to hear when we've got it right. It's awesome. But if you think we're getting it wrong, then tell us. Pick up the phone, don't tell 15 other people first. Come and tell us. And if you need to tell me, then come and tell me. Kei te pai? Okay, so ko mutu te timer. I've only had one bell, there's another one coming. And this little waiata always sticks in my head in respect of our housing kaupapa. Me wa ki te tata, ki te reo karanga, ho atu te aroha. Me wa ki te tata, ki te reo karanga, ho atu te aroha. Ko tō tātou hia hia, kia pai te no, i era kainga, ngā kainga mahana. Me wa ki te tātou, ki te reo karanga, ho atu te aroha. Kia ora mai tātou.
Look, stay here. I'll just we'll see if there are any burning questions.
Okay.
Are there any burning questions? Wonderful. Wait for the panel. Okay then. Look, Dai, anei e koha mau. Te tuku atu ngā mai. Look, being a servant of the government is not always easy, and often we are representative of the system that has not served us. But I have to say that we need good people in those places so that there are barriers broken down so we can come and see people like Dai. So thank you, Dai. And just to say, my friend Nancy, she works at Te Puni Kōkiri. Apparently she's something quite high up the chain in terms of whānau ora. I don't really know, but she tells me that Dai's a good woman and to be nice to her piri. So, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe. Look, just for, yes. You know that whānau ora thing, I think I was 23 years old. My friend Nancy and I were working at Te Oranganui Iwi Health Authority in Wanganui. At the time, Tariana Turia was the CEO of Te Oranganui. She used to make us do really random things like go out to her place at Wangaihu, sit up till 4 o'clock in the morning, typing up all this stuff for her. At that time, both Nancy and I didn't know what the stuff was, and it was actually the template for whānau ora. So I often feel grateful You know how the aunties can just tell you to do things like that night after night, 4 o'clock in the morning. Auntie, I've got my kids at home, yes, they'll be fine with mum, darling. But if it wasn't for women like that who had foresight, then we wouldn't have some of the achievements that we do today. Look, I want to just remind us all, your strategic workshop papers are in the middle of your table. And I'm going to be plugging this every opportunity. Please take the time to have a look at it, write some key points down. At morning tea, I'm going to give you information about how we move to those workshops later on today, so you can all do exactly the opposite and go somewhere else. But we're hoping to get some really robust discussion going with those workshops today. Oti noa, we have been spoilt for choice over the last few days in terms of international speakers. I've attended a number of World Indigenous Peoples conferences on education, and I've loved every one of them. I think we've had our own little World Indigenous Peoples Conference on housing right here in Tauranga Moana. And I want to salute our international speakers, our Indigenous speakers who have come here to share their experiences. We have one of those now making her way to the Ata Mira, ladies and gentlemen, from the Aboriginal housing in Victoria. It is the largest Aboriginal housing provider in Australia and the only Aboriginal agency to achieve housing association status. Here to share her stories, Aboriginal Housing Victoria, our journey to self-determination. Ladies and gentlemen, Jenny Sams. Kia ora, Jenny.
Good, gosh, I'm just getting used to the light. It's stunning, literally. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. And as is our custom in our land, I'd like to do the same here and acknowledge traditional owners and pay my respects to any elders here today and elders past and present. Thank you for having us. Our chair, Tim Chatfield, had to leave on Friday afternoon for a family commitment, but we're very proud of where we're at, and it's a very, very different story from those you've heard, but like all these things, hopefully you can take some things out of it and at least have some hints on some of the things you may do into the future. What I'd like to do is just go very, very briefly, and something like this, it's a very fast overview and I'm very conscious of that, but briefly into the sort of history of Victoria's Aboriginal people, or southeastern Australia, because of course Victoria is a colonial construct. The sort of outcomes for Aboriginal people today, and they're probably similar to what you all experience. And the stages we've gone through in this journey to self-determination, the challenges we have ahead, particularly around asset management, which has been a real intellectual mind bender in many respects, but we've delivered on at least conceptually. And some of the things about being a good landlord. And I'd have to say at the outset, we have developed individual properties. We're not a big property developer at this point, so we're a bit different in that respect. So beginning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across Australia, there's over 700,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, which is around 3% of Australia's population. It's a growing proportion though. And against what many people believe or conceive, almost 80% live in regional and metropolitan areas. The largest populations are in the cities, closest to coastal areas. Only 14% live in very remote areas, and there are around 45% of Australians living in those areas. It's very important though, and people in remote areas are the ones you'll see the things on TV and all the rest, and how bad the conditions often are. They're not always that bad. You know, many communities are doing a sterling job. There's a real debate now, and I think it's a very, very legitimate one, aside from people's right to live on their land. Do you really want to clear out the vast interiors of Australia so you have no population? I mean, it's mind-bogglingly stupid. So there are those sort of debates going on. In Victoria, and that's us down the bottom for those of you who might not know Australia well, our population's growing very, very rapidly. It's 54,000 now and projected to reach 70,000 by 2026. A British journalist just recently in The Guardian, his name's slipping my mind for the moment, said he'd come to Australia, I think he was in Sydney or Melbourne, one or the other, and he didn't see any Aboriginal people. Rest assured he probably did, but he probably decided they were Indian or Sri Lankan or anything but, which is a bit frustrating at times because people have got one depiction of what an Aboriginal person is. They live in the remote outback and they've got certain features, and like all people, we vary across the country and our history varies. In Victoria, Aboriginal people are less than 1% of the total population, so they are spread thin. Almost half live in Melbourne, and most others in the regional centres. And like most population change in Victoria, probably most advanced countries, there's a shift of people from smaller and rural areas into the next size town, to the regional centre, to the big urban centres. And it's happening with Aboriginal populations, but it's happening sort of 20 years behind the general population. But that same shift's happening, and we have to be very, very aware of that when we're planning for our housing, education and everything else. So often the disadvantage in Victoria is invisible. Sadly, if you saw some of our houses, and it is a very sad thing, some of them are poor stock in the first place, but the issues, the social issues, contribute to severe damage in housing. And I think it's important to also mention, and probably you're all aware of this as well, but it's a good reminder, Victoria wasn't, nor was Australia, settled with a treaty. In fact, John Batman, when he came to Melbourne, and the Hentys were already in southwest Victoria, whaling and doing other things, Batman exchanged his beads and blankets because that, he decided, was his form of a treaty and would satisfy the British Home Office. And I'll leave that with you. So the disconnection and forced removal from land and community happened very early and very rapidly in Victoria. Some of this is, of course, just my, that's without argument. Some of the rest is my sort of view of the world. But I think many white settlers in Tasmania did a very, very good and fast job of taking over the land and exterminating the people. And many of those, including some of my ancestors, I have to say, then came up through Victoria, and really they knew how to do it. They knew how to clear the people out very quickly. That picture up there is not typical Aboriginal housing in Victoria. It's post-settlement or invasion housing. It's very well recognised now, though probably not accepted and known across all areas, that Aboriginal people in southeast Australia, and indeed much of Australia, lived in villages, in settlements, practised agriculture, certainly moved from time to time with the seasons, as most of us do when we go on holiday and all the rest of it. But you know, the houses were there down at Lake Condah. The stone houses are considered one of, if not the earliest sign of human beings living in villages and in settlements, and they had a massive eel farming system, and in fact Engineering Australia's recognised it as a vast engineering feat. So this is sort of the product of the rapid dispossession. The forced removal of children. Victoria was the first to have a Half-Castes Act, unfortunately, and various acts for the so-called protection and management of Aboriginal natives. With some of that, there are even things as specific and petty as who owned the blankets you got when you're on the mission, and if you left you didn't own the blankets and you had to take them with you. I was reading it again the other day. It's funny, you read these things and you think, oh gosh, then you go back and you look at it and you think, oh my God, how did this happen? But the Half-Castes Act, and you know, in an environment where you have this fast white settlement, and then you bring in a Half-Castes Act where already many of the children were from mixed parentage, and you had the power to remove those children, had a massive impact, and the grief is still felt today. And again, some of the things we see in our housing, I believe, is the result of the dreadful dispossession and breakdown in social structures and family lives. And sometimes we're very, very surprised where you'll see people who honestly do not know how to keep a house. They haven't been empowered to live their own lives and look after their own houses. So it really has had a massive impact felt till this day. Severe disadvantage, probably familiar data to you again, but nine times as likely to be clients of homelessness services, and that's not counting the forms of homelessness that are very common in our community and aren't really called homelessness, where you take families in and you have overcrowded houses, which, you know, we're pretty relaxed about other than the impact on the family, but that's sort of outside of those figures. Aboriginal people are 3 times as likely to be social housing tenants, far less likely to achieve home ownership. Unemployment rates are higher, lower average weekly earnings. Perinatal mortality rates are around, I think, 3 times higher. 7 times more likely to be affected by family violence incidents. The Victorian government's doing a fantastic job in trying to tackle family violence across the community and is very respectful of the need in Aboriginal communities and the need to design the solutions from within. I really have to pay tribute to them, and of course I do because of where we've ended up now in terms of ownership of the properties. In our houses, 30% are experiencing family violence, and that's people responding to a survey, and of course the shame factor means that it would be higher. Children, 11 times as likely to be in out of home care, overrepresentation in justice. In Australia, Aboriginal women are the growing group of prisoners in the country, fastest growing group of prisoners in the country, which again, you know, the impact on families and children is massive. And I think it's around 90% of Victorian Aboriginal women leaving prisons have been victims of family violence as well. And I think sometimes people forget that family violence isn't a simple situation where you have your sort of classic victim and perpetrator. It's far more complex than that, and that's not a pretty sight, as we know. And you know, it's entrenched. Our organisation started off as the Aboriginal Housing Board in 1981. It was established around the time when, and perhaps slightly after, when a number of Aboriginal organisations were established in Victoria. And it was at that time where there was a sort of growing recognition of civil rights. There were white activists who really joined with Aboriginal people to get up, for instance, the Aboriginal Legal Service, the Health Service, Children Agency, Education, the Victorian Aboriginal Education Association, etc., etc. So there was this groundswell of organisations, and they have persisted to this day, which I think says something about the strength. The organisation was set up for, oh, those arrows have come out in the wrong spot in the translation. There you are, that's what happens when you email stuff. It was set up around advocacy, to advocate into the Victorian government, into the old Housing Commission on the housing needs of Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people were sleeping in tents on the river. Some still are now because we've had a new upsurge in homelessness and living in very poor public housing. So it was around advocacy into government about housing needs and gradually took on a role of providing assistance with collection of rental arrears. And there was, and still is to some degree, an attitude amongst Aboriginal people, particularly older people, why should I pay rent for something that's on my own land anyway? And that's understandable, but of course we've got to move into a new world and survive. But it's why the transfer of ownership becomes important. That's Auntie Pat Ockwell, and you can see her quote, a great beginning, what we want is home ownership too. So here in 2016 we've done it. This is a great little, can you see that? Can you see that headline? That was only 1980 where we thought it was all right to have a headline saying the blacks were to advise the state. Another curiosity. My daughter was born in 1980, so it doesn't seem that long ago, but anyway. Again, I'm travelling through a long history pretty quickly. The next step was tenancy management, and Robert Macbeth here, who was working in Victoria at the time, was around for some of this and played a role. And, you know, listening to the previous speaker, and I was a bureaucrat for 35 years, you do have to have your friends in government. You do have to make yourself an organisation that's easy to work with. And we wouldn't have got to where we are today without good bureaucrats and without working cooperatively. You have your difference, but you have to work together. 2008, Aboriginal Housing Victoria took on tenancy management of 1,448 government houses tenanted by Aboriginal Victorians. This was after a long period of consultation, talking to people about those who are willing to transfer their tenancy management from the Office of Housing to Aboriginal Housing Victoria, and these are the ones that come across. There hasn't been a further round of that, and I think there probably needs to, though we have to settle down and consolidate. At this point, Aboriginal Housing Victoria became a registered housing provider, and that was part of the requirement for the tenancy management. In 2013, we took on responsive maintenance, massive job, and over the years have accumulated up until the latest transfer, 76 properties, though they seem to be flowing in at a regular and faster rate in general. We then moved to ownership. Self-determination, that's Tim and me looking very happy a few weeks ago with the deed, the asset conversion deed that the Director of Housing had signed, which essentially transferred ownership of all of the government properties that AHV manages across to us. That's been done, yeah, I'll clap myself. They're doing it in 3 tranches. The 511 metropolitan properties came across in July, which was really very nice because, of course, the metropolitan properties are worth a lot more than the regional properties. So it's really given us a very, very solid asset base. And in the following years, the other properties will come across into tranches. So what did we have to do to get there? It's been a very long journey. It's been incredibly hard work. I'd have to say the last few years have been one of the hardest things I've done. Excuse me. The government decided we had to be a housing association before we could take ownership. Part of me at the time, to be honest, thought, you're just putting that there as a barrier. You don't think we can become a housing association, so we're going to do it. Because actually, strictly speaking, I don't think we needed to get up to that next level. But anyway, we did. The other part of it is, and we lobbied early and worked with, there was an election coming up. We worked with the Shadow Minister for Housing, who was the Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, and who I'd had a long working relationship with as well. He said at the time, yeah, you'll get your properties, we're going to give you 300 of them. And we thought, 300 out of 1,500? No. So we kept on working, and this government in Victoria has come in with a strong agenda on self-determination and has dipped its toe in the water on developing a treaty, which is a very, very difficult task, and particularly from the position of a state government. And they came to adopt transfer of ownership of the properties as self-determination for our organisation. So it shifted the transfer away from all the arguments about who should own public housing, whether you have a community housing sector or whatever, you know, there's a whole lot of ideological and other arguments there, but it shifted it away, and that was a very important thing. So we didn't have to get into a competition with all of the mainstream housing organisations. That would have been just the end for us. So I reckon in simple terms, there are 4 areas where we had to do a lot of work. The first was governance. Tim Chatfield, and this preceded me, changed the nature of the board. It's board with 7 members. It's a commercially oriented board and it has to be. We'd had regional councils, they no longer exist. So something's been lost in a sense, you know, it's harder to get to the grassroots and determination at that level, but we really had to become very streamlined to get to where we are. Once we consolidate our position with the properties and they're with us, I think you can then return to a more inclusive form of governance, but you have to have the vehicle to be commercially orientated to take on what we've taken on. And, you know, when we own all the properties, it'll be $500 million worth of properties transferred from government. It's not small bickies, so you have to be very, very serious. We had to work on our internal capacity. The organisation actually, I think, from 2008 to 2013, well, probably from 2010 to 2013, had gone downhill a bit. It's been very hard to get up the tenancy management role, and I think people have lost sight of the business they're in many respects. Rental arrears became the dominant thing, not caring for tenants, not thinking about work with other Aboriginal organisations, community in general. So there was a very fundamental shift, and that was tough. The vast majority of people have stepped up, without doubt. Our staff turnover is still at the industry average, and I mean housing organisations average, but some people have moved on. We've got a strong executive management group, and we're a tightly held group, and we couldn't do it without that again. There's a lot you've got to withstand, and you all know that as well. It's not, you've got to have your debates internally, but when you go out there, you've got to stand together. You really do. We had to upskill our housing officers, very big issue. Again, as I say, from essentially managers of rental arrears to people that understood the ambiguity in the role, the diversity of what you're dealing with, had empathy, and also became innovative. And, you know, some are better at that than others, like everywhere, but it is improving. When I arrived, only 30% of the staff were Aboriginal, which was a bit disappointing. None of the senior managers were. Now 50% are Aboriginal staff, and senior managers particularly so. So that is good, and we're continuing to develop up other staff so that they have the general management skills to move up into those jobs. But there's some fantastic examples of really, really good people doing very strong work, and the technical work, they're doing it as well as anyone else, but hopefully with your own cultural overlay. In terms of performance, we had to meet the industry benchmarks. Some we weren't bad on, others we're a long way away from, so we've had to do a lot of work there. And external relationships had really fallen by the wayside. We have very strong relationships with all the other statewide Aboriginal organisations, various of the local cooperatives, but also with other organisations. Any of you who've lived in Victoria would probably recognise the face in the bottom right-hand corner. That's the former Premier Steve Bracks, with our Deputy Chair Ian Ham. We signed a memorandum of understanding with AFL Sports Ready, which Steve chairs, and actually I'm on the board, and that's probably helped matters a bit. I'm actually the Deputy Chair, as a matter of fact, but you know, but what it's meant, relationships, as we know, it's all about relationships. But what it's meant is we've got good traineeships for our internal staff, and I'm really pleased. We've got 3 trainees at the moment. I mean, one of them's 16. He's got a 2.5-year-old child. He's battling to find housing. It's ironical. But there he is, you know, he's coming to work every day, and his training's managed by AFL Sports Ready. But we will be moving in. We've just got a Victorian Government contract for 60 positions, and we're hoping people in our housing, because stable housing is a precondition for employment, will be taking up those opportunities and moving into jobs, and we'll continue to support the housing. But it's also as we get into more technical skilled jobs like project management and what have you, that we have a partner who can provide the training and the support. So again, you know, that's a really superficial overview, but they're the sort of areas. Just let me check time. So our asset base at the moment is $250 million. It'll go to 500 million by 2018. It gives us the opportunity to grow and realign the stock. I've heard from many speakers about the need you have for 1 and 2 bedroom accommodation units of whatever sort. We're exactly the same. We need the very big houses with lots of bedrooms for the very big families, but Aboriginal Australians and Victorians have lower life expectancy than the general community, but life expectancy is increasing. And I don't actually think anyone's come to terms with what it means to look after an ageing Aboriginal population, because the assumption is that it won't happen. So Tim's thinking hard about units for elders, retirement villages, etc., etc. But family breakdown means you have, people are marrying earlier or partnering earlier, having children earlier, but relationships are breaking down earlier. So you need more accommodation for broken families and for the single partner, whichever one they are, without the children. There's a very big need for that smaller housing stock. But one of the real things is we've got to manage depreciating stock. It's old stock, but it also is depreciating like any housing does. So we had to do our 15-year financial modelling to take account of that depreciation, and we will make a loss at the end of the 15-year period on because of depreciation, but that's pretty standard for housing organisations. Certainly operationally we won't be making a loss, but again we had to manage around that. And then being a good landlord and supporting the community, many of whom are disadvantaged. So you've got a number of balls in the air that you're really juggling. And I sort of think there's this inherent tension. This is extraordinary. In emailing it across, that's quite a different chart. Anyway, it's all right. The tension between collecting the rent and managing arrears. Managing the assets and sustaining the tenancies. So we want to sustain tenancies. There's a point at which, though, you can only manage with arrears to a certain level. And we need, because we're self-funded, we need the rent to manage the assets, to do the maintenance, to do the upgrades and all the rest. So it is a very difficult balancing act. Many of our tenants get very, very angry when they hear about other members of the community not paying the rent and wrecking their houses. There's probably less tolerance there than we have, but you know, we want to sustain tenancies. We have low turnover, but we do have massive damage to houses in many cases. So I'll just quickly go through, and it's very much an overview, how we've tackled managing the assets and a little bit about our tenancy role and how we're tackling that as well. But really it's the sort of thing, if at some time you want more information, we need to sit down and workshop it in more detail. So again, it's coming from the commitment to self-determination. Our strategic plan's the overview. I know this is the technical stuff, but it's been important. It's how we've managed to prove our credentials and get title. So the strategic plan's the overview. We have 3 key documents under that: the asset management strategy, the community engagement strategy and communication strategy, an annual business plan which is required for our registration, and an asset management plan that goes into all the detail of which property is going to be turned over when, you know, acquired, disposed, etc., etc. Our 1,500 properties are spread across the state. We don't have concentrated properties anywhere. We don't have villages. We don't have high-rise towers. It's a particular sort of asset portfolio. We sought external advice. Well, in fact, we wanted a consultant to do our asset strategy and asset planning, and we couldn't find anyone anywhere who could do it. And I'm talking about going to the PwCs and KPMGs and all the rest. So we did it. And Darren Smith in my area, he's got an incredible brain and he's technically fantastic, and he sat down and nutted it out. And we've got a fantastic Chief Financial Officer as well. So there's a lot of intellectual property in there, and we're willing to share it to a point. But it's something, you know, it's another one of those things where you can do it. You actually don't have to rely on all the formulaic stuff that lives out there. You can get together and do it. So We went through early steps of checking or building the knowledge, collecting the evidence. We needed to know the details of our houses, their condition. From that, we developed plans and procedures. We increased the organisational capacity and the capabilities to act on what we know. And we put all of that together into an action plan with some certainty around how we'd achieve the outcomes. And we're now going into the implementation of that at the moment. It'll come, I think. Oh. Okay, so we purchased a data collection and analysis tool called SPM Assets. Anyone who's going to be developing an asset portfolio that's more than a few properties, I think, needs something like this. We're undertaking property condition reports, so every one of those properties we're going out and checking their condition and feeding the detail into the system. It's a very good training opportunity for people. In fact, I think it's money for jam doing property condition reports, and it's another one of those areas where we've got job opportunities. Out of all of that, we can run portfolio-wide reports and develop capital life cycle replacement and cyclical maintenance plans over a 25-year period. So every year we'll know what to do, which doesn't mean it's always easy to do it, but we do know how to do it, especially if people don't want to leave the house they're living in, which is understandable. We identify across the portfolio the properties nearing the end of their usable life and make informed decisions on what we're going to do over a long period of time and adjust our financial projections against it. Something's happening differently here. All of this allows us to make informed evidence-based decisions, and it's a bit boring, but it's critical. Efficiently allocate the funds to the property maintenance and capital works aspects. And as you know, maintenance can eat up everything, but you can't let it. And ensure that we're able to deliver sustainable, affordable and culturally appropriate housing into the future. Well, exactly, absolutely, exactly right. Essentially what we're doing, and it's a fairly common concept, but we're working on the basis of asset recycling. So the oldest and most inefficient of the properties are turned over, and the newer properties arguably have lower maintenance costs. So it's a simple concept, but you know, essentially that's how we're projecting out and believe that we can do this in a financially sustainable way. So it's really a balance between increasing available stock, which we'll be doing, but only by incremental amounts. It's not going to be an enormous increase. We'll probably only be increasing the total stock by up to 12 a year, and that's in the out years. Certainly better design, more suitable housing, lower responsive maintenance costs. We're using tougher materials for walls and what have you. In fact, that portable building out there is using a similar product, those structural insulation panels, I think I've got it right. But you really can't punch holes in them, which is a big problem with... I say this in here amongst those who understand and are sympathetic. I have to say, when the title transfer was announced, there was the usual amount of racism in the press, and someone made a comment that I was offended by, but I guess we can laugh about that. There'll be a lot more work for plasterers now, Aboriginal people in their houses. But hopefully reduce costs for tenants, because houses are environmentally more sustainable and longer term viability. So again, I'm going all right. We do it by recycling properties, those with a low remaining economic life or deemed not suitable. We'll purchase new properties better aligned with the needs of people and redevelop existing stock. We are a bit fortunate, while we have a generally run-down portfolio, we have a number of properties where you've got small run-down houses on big blocks of land in areas that have become gentrified. We will either demolish those houses and build maybe 3 units on the block, or sometimes just sell and move a bit further out And my view is, I mean, Melbourne's an expensive place, but if you're close to services, hospitals, Aboriginal organisations, transport, and there are jobs in those sort of areas. If you've got those things, you actually don't need to be in the centre, and sometimes living costs are dreadfully high in the newly gentrified areas, as we know. Better engaging with the community, I think we've got a way to go. I think we've got to keep working hard there. But we are working with community to ensure the housing better aligns with expectations. As I said, the Capital Works and Life Cycle Replacement Program and new and innovative ways of managing and improving standards of our housing. I won't go into this next one in any great detail, but we've completed 6 months of consultations. Aboriginal architect Jifa Greenaway, who's the only Aboriginal architect registered in Victoria, if not Australia, but certainly Victoria, has consulted and come up with 7 design principles. It's a great big book, and again, we're happy to share those. But it is around being culturally responsive, demonstrating connection to country, which even though we're an urban regional population, you can still do and is important. Indigenous homes, quality informing the selection of houses, building community and addressing needs through your housing. As he says, size matters. Particularly, you know, you do have to take into account that family comes to stay and all the rest of it. So it's really size and flexibility and energy efficiency and comfort. And we have the same problems with very energy inefficient houses and have got to do more. Again, very briefly, the cycle, oh, that one really hasn't come out. All right, the cycle over the next 10 years is years 1 to 5, the establishment phase, the structural safety and security works. We've got a lot to do. In a sense, it's securing your stock in a way. Going into the bathroom and kitchen works following that, and then from year 10 onwards, delivery of cyclical replacement programs, upgrades and renovations to existing stock, you know, carpet painting and all the rest of it. So that cycle over the next 10 years is very important, and we will be sticking to it as best we can. So lastly, tenant relationships, and as I said, getting the message across to everyone that our job is to sustain tenancies is not easy, and it is that concept of, I think, dealing with ambiguity. And I say to our staff, everyone has to deal with ambiguity nowadays. You try working at the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, where they're working on family reunion and child protection, and, you know, there's an inherent tension, and we have the same sort of things. So that is a leap in terms of how people think about their jobs. The Victorian government's absolutely determined that government money goes into housing those most disadvantaged, and I have to say, probably because I've been a public servant for 35 years, I absolutely agree. I really don't think the government's job is to put money into housing the middle classes, essentially, and that sort of creep's happened in the public policy arena we've got in housing in our country and our state. However, people that are victims of family violence, that are homeless, or family reunion, in other words, families broken up because children have been in child protection, are not going to be your easiest tenants. Very few of them will walk in and just establish the tenancy and all's fine. It requires a lot of hands-on, and I heard something about a fund you've got that you can draw on. We have nothing, and I do think it's an absolute gap in policy. To provide that support, we have to use tenants' rent. So it's sort of the disadvantaged funding the even more disadvantaged, which isn't so good. But also we've got to work to reduce damage, so home visits have got to be more regular. We're trying to adjust them to tenant risk. We're working on living skills and developing low maintenance housing. So it's that skill to manage complex cases and manage those inherent tensions. I won't go through it. This is very wordy and I won't go through it all. We're overhauling our allocations procedures, better property descriptions so people know what they're going into. In years gone by, many people got the phone call that we've got a 3-bedroom house at blah. They didn't even get the chance to look at it. So we have better property descriptions, better details on our clients, and our clients are people on the waiting list as well as those in houses. So better matching, but also triaging people so that we know, or we hope we know, those that are going to need higher interventions early on, so that we put our time and effort more into those most in need. So that means we're having a meeting with applicants, and sometimes we will be interviewing a number of applicants before a final match is made. We work through the services needed. Some tenancies, we're even saying the tenancy is conditional upon you engaging with other services. Now, I have to say we don't evict people because they don't engage with other services, but you're trying to set it up right from the start. If you've got mental health problems or drug and alcohol problems, your tenancy's not going to work if you don't have some support. Homelessness, another one even more so, you know, people coming from sleeping rough into housing, it requires support. So again, a sort of triaging approach and easing off after 6 to 12 months when the tenancy's established. A life skills program, again funded out of tenants' rent, only operating in the metro area at the moment. Practical assistance, starter packs, intervention when people go into arrears to help and support. And personalised, culturally sensitive and practical support. We say to people, tell us when things are going wrong, tell us when there's damage to the house, don't keep it a secret, it's better to reach out and talk to us. If you've got problems you can't deal with, talk to us about it, and it's why you need Aboriginal staff to overcome all of that shame. But if you don't get there early, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And I'm finishing, not bad time. So, in summary, engaging with tenants, I think resetting the relationship. We're establishing a Metro Tenants reference group on the back of the title transfer, and we've got some wonderful elders who are putting their hands up and excited about that. New ways of engaging with community, better communications. Our Facebook page is just booming, I have to say, and not getting the sort of lateral violence and negativity that you could expect. It's been, you know, pretty positive stuff, yeah. In fact, no, I won't go into it. Certainly not the lateral violence from community. And changing expectations through, as I said, the employment and training opportunities. One woman came into the counter the other day and said, I've done so many courses and I can't get a job. And we said, well, you know, we've got this new program. There's going to be 60 supported positions available into the private sector. We've got partnerships with Bunnings, for instance. You might have an opportunity. People then see themselves differently. I'm not just a tenant in bloody, you know, social housing. I'm a tenant. I'm going to get a job and I've got pathways to the future. We're looking at pathways to home ownership. It's a long way off, but we're looking at that. And a new project with Melbourne University in the Whittlesea area, working with tenants, developing household aspiration plans around your household, your health, your education, training, etc. So that's where we're at. And thank you very much for listening. I don't speak your language.
Family wellbeing, one of what a very big code. Yeah, it's everything. See, we're of like mind. Now we do have a couple of minutes for any questions that you might have in the audience. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to bomba. There's a question over here. If we can get a microphone. It's day 3 of the conference, and my 2IC's just a little bit on the tired side.
Well, I admire you all for being here. I had the night off.
Over here.
You're right about the lights.
Yes, yeah.
Good morning, Jenny.
Hello.
Scott Figgenshaw from Community Housing Aotearoa. Fantastic presentation. Key question here is, can you just confirm that transfer? What was the price that you paid for the transfer?
Nothing.
Thank you very much.
can I make a quick point? And I didn't make it during the presentation, but it's thinking about self-determination. Native title in Victoria, because we're an urbanised community, doesn't deliver anything much, because freehold title extinguishes native title. So it delivers Crown land and minor parcels. To get freehold title on these properties is as close to getting your land back as you'll ever get, in our view.
Kia ora, Jenny. Victoria from PSL. Thank you so much for your presentation and taking the time to come over and share your time with us. You might be aware that stock transfer is occurring here in New Zealand, and it's being rolled out here first in Tauranga. Māori have really been on the back foot, Māori and iwi organisations on the back foot in terms of how that process has been rolling out through the government. And in a sense, we've had to sort of run to catch up to the train that government have set in terms of pace of the stock transfer, both policies and process. What could we do today at this conference to help influence that, given that government have made an announcement in terms of stock here, which essentially does not include iwi or Māori organisations that are involved in housing, regardless of the fact that we did try to engage and be part of that process. I think we need to really catch up to that train and have some sort of response back to government about the stock transfer process it's undertaking, because what they will roll out here, they will roll out in every other region. And if we're not prepared as iwi and Māori organisations, we're going to get railroaded straight over. So I'd really appreciate your advice to us about what we could start doing immediately and then long term, so that we have some sort of national strategy around it. Kia ora.
No, thank you. I don't like giving advice where I don't know your country and I don't know your people and I don't know the context, but so I can only talk from what our experience has been. In 2008, when, and Robert Macbeth will know some of these details better than me, I think, actually, from his position in housing, but when housing associations were established in Victoria, and we weren't one, and there was a certain amount of stock transfer, nothing like what we've got, but we were not considered in there either. It was the work that was done to meet all of the mainstream criteria that did it for us. And you've got to, that creates a bit of tension within community because you're doing something different. But I don't think you can do it without meeting those criteria, but you can meet the criteria, and you've just got to, you have a similar sort of housing provider, housing association registration type thing, don't you? Half and half, I can see. But you do have to meet those accreditation standards, I think. And then I just think you have to go in, as I said, and make yourself a friend of government. There is a moral imperative here, but there's also a practical one, because we can do a good job with our community and, you know, we will make you look good, if anything. Well, it's true though, you know, we'll make you look good, and that's a big responsibility to live up to. And listening to you, and again, I don't understand enough about how your structures work and your organisations. I think if you've got many small structures, you're going to have to probably get together into some sort of federation, and the federation or cooperative group or whatever gets the accreditation. And then you just go in very hard on the basis of your bona fides, and I'm more than happy to have more of a conversation about it.
Kia ora, Jenny. Kia ora tātou, Te Tauru White Indigenuity Limited. Jenny, congratulations on a great presentation on self-determination by Aboriginal people. Congratulations for that.
Thank you.
It's interesting that, you know, in my view, governments are notoriously bad and inefficient managers of assets. So in the transfer, you have a great opportunity to create value, create efficiencies, and that's a really good thing. I was interested in your comment that it costs nothing in terms of the price, but what is the actual price in the transfer? Because the reality, as I see it, is in giving this asset, it's a great opportunity, but with it comes great problems. And one of the biggest ones is the great expectations that now sit upon your shoulders to deal to a multi-billion-dollar problem that the government is seen to be in place to try and address, and they're not doing it. So in this transfer, what level of ongoing support are they giving you to solve this problem that they should not be cut off from, that they have an obligation to still deliver to, not rest all the expectations on your organisation, for example?
Well, the other side of the story is, in fact, they're not giving us anything to run the business. We're right in there now on various funding rounds, but they're like family violence housing, which again is a housing without support. There's a homelessness round. They're small numbers of houses by our new way of thinking, I have to say. Perhaps not, we would have thought 8 houses was a great addition. Now we're thinking, oh yeah. But they're not giving us anything. But what we did, and that was the challenge, and again, as I say, we've got a strong commercially focused board. It's 4 Aboriginal people, 3 non-Aboriginal. Owen Donald, former Director of Housing in Victoria, is on the board. He knows what he's doing. We worked through the plans, the financial plans, the asset management plans, and we believe that we've got the money from the rent to do the job. Part of what we actually did, and again, it's probably my many decades as a public servant, in convincing government to do this, I actually lifted recommendations and reworded them from former Auditor General reports where they said that the housing stock's not been cared for and DHS hasn't got the processes in place. Our asset planning now and the approach we're taking exceeds what's happening in the department. And someone from the department said to us, because I was making the comment about, well, you know, this is when the properties they're owning, well, what are you doing with your upgrade program? You've got to upgrade these properties, not just hand them over with absolutely no maintenance. And this person said, you know what it's like, Jenny, we've got a budget and we just rule a line when the budget's used. Now, if we approached what we're doing in that way, we're going to have stock that's dysfunctional. What we have done in our forward projections is actually attempted to allocate the money out of our income against the need to recycle the assets, and I think we can do it. Well, I don't think we can, I know we can, and we're going into the first year and we're well and truly on the way. However, we have the advantage and disadvantage, but the advantage of critical mass. And it's probably a bit different if you've got a very small stock. Critical mass gives you a bit of leeway, gives you a bigger burden, but, you know, a bit of leeway.
Okay, well, we've run out of time and I might like to encourage you during the morning tea to have a chat with Jenny if you have any more burning issues. Long as you don't one more when I start screaming at you to come back after morning tea.
Kia ora, my name's Aubrey Takanoa. Just got a question about whether, when you went through that stock transfer, were there any limitations put on you by the criteria by the government that prevented you from diversifying your asset portfolio? Because you are, you know, social housing stock. Were you limited from disposing of some assets, or were you limited from actually picking up other types of assets which helps fund, you know, your social housing stock? Did they put any limitations on you? And if you could redesign it, you know, how would you?
Yes and no. We have to maintain the number of housing units for social housing. They don't have to be standalone houses, but we have to have, you know, maintain that. We can't dispose of houses without getting the Director of Housing's approval, but it's a formality, so that's not a major thing. And the government, it hasn't been announced yet, but I had a call from the Minister's advisor on Thursday here saying we're about to announce, and we think the other housing organisations are going to go mad about it. We're going to announce that you have to take priority applicants from the waiting list. Well, for us, that's what we do, and it's what we morally think we should be doing. So, you know, we're at the sort of shining light in that respect. But the other key restrictions, if we move into the area of developing houses to sell to community, which I think is quite feasible and viable, but we're probably going to have to, we need to bed down what we've got, and then we'd need to move into developing, I think, a separate vehicle to manage that side. And whether then income fed back or it kept on funding new developments, I don't know. So yeah, there are restrictions, but we've taken them into account and still done our financial modelling and think we can do it.
Ka pai, thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Can I just also say, I know they're a bit boring, but they might be useful for you. Oh, this one's not boring. I'll leave our book More Bees with Honey, which is an early history, and our strategic plan and annual report, and I've got other documents as well, but, you know, these two aren't very exciting, but you've all got to have them, as you know.
I think you underestimate the people here. When you talk strategic, these people here, strategy is what they do. So don't be surprised if you get a wee bit of a roll on for this kind of reading. Jenny, just to say, firstly, to acknowledge the journey that the Aboriginal people have had in their country, and perhaps I am mindful of the role or the impact that we as New Zealanders, and in particular as Māori people, are having on the Aboriginal journal at this point in time. I'll leave that there, kua mohi o ke koutou, ngā whakaaro o roto o te rā kupu. And to say that in this group here at this conference, you have friends of like mind.
Thank you.
So hopefully you've made some of those and you will know where to get support and encouragement. Hopefully